A logical psychoanalysis of contemporary environmentalism. In his book, Apocalypse Never, Michael Schellenberger criticizes environmental alarmism, which is the systematic exaggeration and misrepresentation of facts surrounding environmental issues such as climate change. In previous lectures, we looked at Schellenberger's take on these. He argued that much of the rhetoric from environmentalist groups surrounding these issues was alarmist. When discussed his accusation that most environmentalists are working in tandem with oil and gas industry, whether they know it or not. Today we will discuss the final chapter where Schellenberger offers more or less a psychoanalysis of contemporary environmentalism. But before we get to psychoanalysis, I would like to spell out a more strictly logical issue, Schellenberger's accusation that contemporary environmentalists strawman the dissent. To understand and evaluate his accusation, we need to understand the Strawman Fallacy, which is a characteristic error in reasoning. The Strawman Fallacy is committed when someone criticizes a less plausible version of an argument or view than what was intended. Here is a blatant example. Suppose that Sally says, we should relax the laws regulating cannabis use. And imagine that Joe retorts, no, because if people get unrestricted access to all intoxicants and drugs, they will lose their work ethic and will become reckless thrill seekers. Productivity will fall dramatically and crime rate will go up. In this example, Joe commits the Strawman fallacy because the view he attributes to Sally is significantly less plausible than the view Sally intended to state. After all, the view Sally actually articulated was a modest one. We should relax the laws regulating cannabis use. But that's not the view Joe attributed to Sally. The view Joe attributed to Sally is a much less plausible one. We should give people unrestricted access to everything. On this view, Sally would be claiming that a 9-year-old should be able to buy fentanyl. So, Joe is criticizing a strawman's view, not a view the actual Sally holds. And I hope you can see why this is called a fallacy. It's a fallacy because Joe's criticism misses its target. Instead of engaging his interlocutor, the actual Sally, he is engaging someone inside Joe's head. The Strawman fallacy can be committed in 3 different ways. First, one could be taking words out of context. Here's an example. Suppose that Sally tells Joe, I love you as a friend, but I can't see us together as a couple. And Joe lashes back. You say that you love me, but you don't want to sleep with me. You're a liar. Here Joe ignores the context of the phrase I love you and interprets it to mean romantic love, although it's clear that Sally meant it as a friendship. What Joe is doing here is strawman because, again, he is engaging someone in his imagination, not what Sally is actually saying. Another way to commit the strawman fallacy involves criticizing an obsolete, incomplete, or dumbed-down version of a view as opposed to an up-to-date, complete, and intelligent version. Here's an example committed by the French dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. When he was told about steamships, which were back then a brand new invention, Napoleon replied, you would make a ship sail against the winds and currents by lighting a bonfire under her deck? I have no time for such nonsense. Here, Napoleon is committing the strawman fallacy because instead of talking about how steam-powered ships actually work, he describes the idea as lighting a bonfire under the deck. Of course, when put that way, steam power sounds ridiculous. But in reality, it is not ridiculous because the fire is contained in a boiler vessel which transforms the heat into mechanical energy. By ignoring all that and dismissing the dumbed-down characterization, Napoleon made a big mistake, which might have cost him the opportunity of world domination he so craved. Finally, there is the most common version of strawman, treating an extreme case as if it is representative. This one is also the version relevant to Schellenberger's accusation that most environmentalists today commit the Strawman Fallacy against anyone who expresses doubt or disagreement with the core claims of environmentalism, such as nuclear power and plastics are bad, renewables are the way to go, and global warming might end the world as we know it. Indeed, some, maybe most environmentalists today pigeonhole everyone who questions such claims as an ignorant loudmouth, or someone who cannot distinguish the weather from climate, such as Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe here. To see how vacuous Senator Inhofe is, let's watch a short clip taken from a speech he gave on the U.S. Senate floor in 2015.
Of national attention, and in case we have forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record, I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball, and that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
Trump and Inhofe are extremists, and to be blunt, they are either ignorant nutcases or opportunistic narcissists. But not everyone who questions the core claims of contemporary environmentalism is an ignorant nutcase or an opportunistic narcissist. You might be thinking, however, hold on a minute. Nearly half the country voted for Trump. He was elected president. Inhofe, likewise, is a long-standing senator. These people aren't extreme examples. They are the typical representatives of climate skepticism. That characterization, however, is too broad. There is a spectrum of climate dissent, and climate dissenters like Trump, Inhofe, and Schellenberger could be more or less extreme depending on where they are in that spectrum. First, there is the more extreme part of the spectrum, climate denialism. The most extreme form of climate denialism is the claim that climate change is a hoax or conspiracy. Senator Inhofe is on this extreme end because he thinks that climate change isn't real. To him, the claim that the Earth is warming up is a lie made up by Democrats who are bent on destroying the United States. A less extreme version of climate denialism is the claim that climate change is real, but it is not caused by humans. On various occasions, President Trump expressed support for this, claiming that the Earth might be warming up, but it has nothing to do with greenhouse emissions due to human activity. This is a less extreme version of climate dissent than Inhofe because it at least acknowledges that climate change is happening. But it is still extreme overall because it denies simple physics, which we have discussed earlier in the semester. As you would remember, molecules such as carbon dioxide trap solar heat. For someone to deny that releasing carbon dioxide would have no heating effect on the atmosphere, they have to reject nearly everything scientists claim to know. Then there's climate skepticism, something that is less extreme than denialism. One way someone could be a climate skeptic is by accepting that climate change is caused by humans, but claiming that its effects are exaggerated. Schellenberger subscribes to this view, as you know. So, he is a climate skeptic of a certain sort, but he's not a climate denialist. Then there are climate skeptics who accept that climate change is caused by humans, but reject the remedies most environmentalists propose as effective or sufficient. And Schellenberger fits here as well. He, for example, criticizes programs such as Energiewende, which rely heavily on the renewables and try to phase out nuclear. According to Schellenberger, this is a terrible mistake that will have economic and environmental consequences down the line. But that is not a reason for identifying Schellenberger as an extremist. After all, when you conceptualize climate skepticism this way, even Bill Gates is a climate skeptic. He is more or less in agreement with Schellenberger that renewables won't save us, unless there is a revolutionary development in storage technology. In this spectrum, the further you go up, the more extreme the form of climate dissent gets. It gets more extreme in the sense that to maintain such dissent, one has to disagree with a larger and larger portion of what others consider facts. And the lower someone is on this list, the less extreme I would say their climate dissent is. After all, facts are harder to discern when it comes to predicting the specific effects of and possible remedies for climate change. But even among skeptics, there are extremists. Take the claim that climate change is caused by humans, but its effects are exaggerated. Whether someone who makes this claim is an extreme case or not depends on why and how they think the effects are exaggerated. Remember, for instance, Schellenberger's observation that there has been a 92% decline in the death toll from natural disasters since its peak in the 1920s. In that decade, 5.4 million people died from natural disasters. In the 2010s, only 400,000 people did, although the global population nearly quadrupled. And his claim that many of the more worrying impacts of climate change are really symptoms of mismanagement and underdevelopment. Compare those to these gems from Ben Shapiro, the conservative attorney and political commentator who said, suppose that the predictions about sea level rise turn out true. The levels rise by 5 or even 10 feet. The coastal areas get flooded. Don't you think the people who live in those areas won't sell their homes and just move? Apparently, Mr. Shapiro doesn't have even a rudimentary grasp of the difficulty of selling a house that is underwater. The point I am trying to make here isn't that Shapiro is wrong, but Schellenberger is right. They could be both wrong. The point I'm making is rather this. Shapiro is making an argument that cannot convince anyone but small children. Schellenberger, on the other hand, is making a point that is worth considering and engaging. In other words, dismissing him and those like him as extremists doesn't do the issue justice and certainly doesn't solve any of our environmental problems. So, when confronting climate skepticism or any other form of dissent against the majority view, we should refrain from committing the Strawman fallacy. Intellectual charity is the preventive remedy against strawman. If an opinion you have heard sounds stupid, if an argument you read looks like it was written by an idiot, ask yourself the following question. Could I be seeing just a strawman? Could there be a more plausible version of this view? This is actually the principle of charity, a name coined by famous American philosopher Donald Davidson. Here is the principle. When you disagree with someone, always try to interpret what they say in a way that will maximize its plausibility. This principle might strike you as silly. After all, if you follow the principle of charity, you would argue in a way that is not very popular. In the United States, for instance, people argue to win at any cost. If you win by associating your interlocutor with extremism, then great, people think. But always arguing to win is actually terrible. It prevents us from sharing and comparing our perspectives honestly, and combining our brain powers together to tackle complex problems we cannot solve alone. And environmental problems are complex problems. If we aren't vigilant against the strawman when we argue about them, we have no way of solving them. In this context, I would like to hear what you think about two important questions. First, do typical environmental activists observe the principle of charity? Do they make an effort to interpret the views they disagree with in the most plausible way possible? Or do they often commit the Strawman fallacy? Second, does Schellenberger himself observe the principle of charity? When he attacks environmentalists, is he being fair? Next, I will discuss Schellenberger's analysis of the alarmist mindset. Schellenberger identifies several reasons why environmental alarmism has become mainstream. First, there is the appeal to nature, the common belief that natural is always better than artificial. Most of us have this belief, even if we aren't conscious of it. However, artificiality is a consequence of economic development. So as we become more prosperous, more and more of our environment becomes unnatural. Many people react to this change with panic. If everything the eye can see are artifacts, nature must be dying. We must be on the verge of a disaster. Second, Schellenberger blames neo-Malthusianism, the belief that resources and ecosystem integrity cannot withstand indefinite growth. Again, humans saw immense economic growth in the last century and a half. World population and the rate at which we consume resources is simply mind-numbing. It is intuitive to think that this pace cannot be sustained, and if we don't scale it down, we will meet a Malthusian catastrophe. Next, there's environmentalist anti-humanism, which feeds from appeal to nature, and neo-Malthusianism. This is the belief that life on Earth would be better off without humans or with much fewer humans. Many environmentalists dream of a world where human population is scaled back substantially or completely so that the scars we caused on the planet can heal in time. They subscribe to a romantic idea of nature where if we leave the nature alone, it will find harmony and stay there. Then there is secular apocalypticism, the belief that the world as we know it is under an existential threat, and this perceived threat gives lost souls like Thunberg a sense of purpose. According to Schellenberger, this is in part why so many young people are drawn to environmental alarmism. In the Western world, religion is on decline. Moral relativism, the idea that there is no objective right or wrong, is rampant, which makes it very hard to construct and maintain a positive self-image and see one's mortal existence as part of a meaningful cosmic narrative. Feeling lost in this fog of moral ambiguity and existential angst, young people are drawn to a fantastic ideology where the world is in peril and it needs to be saved. Things are black and white. There are clear good guys and clear bad guys. What needs to be done is beyond dispute. So Schellenberger thinks that alarmism is popular in part because it scratches a psychological itch religion and mysticism used to scratch before we realize that we are just upright apes and there is no God. Schellenberger stops his psychoanalysis here, but I will toss in one more thing as bonus. Anti-capitalism/anti-consumerism, which is the belief that capitalism and consumerism are morally and ecologically untenable. Inspired by historical and contemporary critics of capitalism and consumerism, many educated people in the West think that a collapse is inevitable, if not imminent. This feeds into the anxiety about environmental disaster. What do you think about all of this? Is Schellenberger being charitable to environmentalists, or is he dismissing their legitimate concerns as the turmoils of juvenile minds? And finally, after 274 pages and 1,229 footnotes, Schellenberger finally arrives at his alternative to environmental alarmism and the apocalyptic vision underlying it. He calls this alternative environmental humanism. I'm not sure what exactly environmental humanism is. Schellenberger doesn't provide a clear statement or point-by-point breakdown. That's why I will leave you with the following words, which I think comes closest to stating an alternative to apocalyptic environmentalism. Humans are not unthinkingly destroying nature. Climate change, deforestation, plastic waste, and species extinction are not fundamentally consequences of greed and hubris, but rather side effects of economic development motivated by a humanistic desire to improve people's lives. A core ethic of environmental humanism is that rich nations must support, not deny, development to poor nations. Specifically, rich nations should lift the various restrictions on development aid for energy production in poor and developing nations. It is hypocritical and unethical to demand that poor nations follow a more expensive and thus slower path to prosperity than the West followed. As always, I look forward to hearing your take on all this. And this brings me to the end of this lecture. Send me an email if you have any questions. Thank you for your patience, and I'll catch you next time.